With the release of Herman Prime into Rise of Kingdoms, I'm gonna say very confidently the best murderball you can run overall in the open field has obviously changed. And in today's video, I'm going to discuss exactly that murderball. I will give you the strongest marches for a 1 march, 2 march, 3 march murderball, even all the way up to a 7 march murderball. I'll give you some of the best pairings, try to mix around the commanders to get you the most value. So if you want to be able to make the best murderball possible in Rise of Kingdoms, or you're just looking for some possible investments to make your murderball overall stronger, you want to stick around till the end of the video. Now let's start off today's video with an extremely quick disclaimer, and that is I'm going to be focusing more on the meta murderball today, because of course there are tons of substitutes for commanders that I mentioned. Maybe for example if I said Guan Scipio, Scipio Mehmed is going to do fairly decent with a cheaper investment, but that's not the goal of today's video. If I discussed every substitute, the video would be like 3 hours long. Our main goal here today is to make the strongest murderball possible for whatever level you are at, even if you're only running 1 march. So that's the main goal of today's video. Of course, there are tons of substitutes. Feel free to tell me some in the comments, but to keep in mind the main focus today is making the best murderball possible, not necessarily the cheapest or even not necessarily the most free-to-play friendly. So now with the disclaimer out of the way, let's get into discussing using only 1 march. And when you're using only 1 march, there's 3 ways you can go, because I'd say you're going to pick one from any of the following troop type. You're either going to pick an archer march, an infantry march, or a cavalry march. And let's just start off by discussing what if you did choose a cavalry march. And I think the one and only cav march you would pick if you're running just 1 march, it's a Nevsky and a Joan. That's a perfectly fine 1 march murderball. It's gonna do well. Joan's got an AoE and a double AoE as well. She's got some decent stats between some health and even some extra march speed. And also she's buffing other, I guess, marches around you. Because at this point, it's a 1 march murderball. The buffs are not that amazing, but they do get an extra bit of rage per second because it does include her own troops. Nevsky, everyone knows Nevsky, crazy primary, tons and tons of stats, a ridiculous amount of skill damage, really good defense debuff, and also a nice amount of march speed with a fairly valuable expertise. So Nevsky Joan just easily the best cav march in the game, and if you're running just 1 cav march, or even just 1 march in general for cavs, this is a perfectly fine march. If you chose to run an infantry march as your only march, Scipio Lao Che, like, do I have to say anything extra? Scipio's got one of the best debuffs in the game, 30% health reduction to 3 targets, he's got an AoE, he's got really good amounts of stats, he's got tons of march speed, he's even got a shielding effect, which I think is his 4th skill right here, which can be really, really nice, and he's got a way to make it so he takes 30% reduced all damage whenever he takes any skill damage, and there is a little cooldown on this, but it is still very good, especially if you take an active skill. It means the secondary commander skill is going to deal a ton less damage. So Scipio is really tanky, tons of AoE. Put that with Lao Che, probably the strongest infantry commander, 5 target AoE, march speed reduction. Also, he's got tons of stats, ridiculous amounts of march speed as well, do keep that in mind. Infantry need march speed, Lao Che has tons of it. He's got skill damage reductions for whenever you take AoE, and then he's just doing tons of smite damage, which allows you to bypass all skill damage reductions on other commanders. So Scipio Lao Che, really good infantry march, and it's probably the strongest, if not the second strongest possible march you can currently make. Then if you chose to make an archer march, at this point a Zhulang with a Herman is definitely the way you would go. This is arguably the strongest or second strongest march in the game, and it's ridiculous how strong it is. Zhulang has a 5 target AoE just like Lao Che, he's got an all damage reduction to everyone that gets hit, he's got a fair amount of health, he's got good amounts of extra damage on his 4th skill, which gets boosted by his expertise, and he's also got a ton of skill damage bonuses. Not to mention, put him with Herman Prime, probably the strongest debuff in the whole entire game right now, and also his own AoE, he's boosting AoE damage, he's taking up to 15% less all damage, and he's got a ton of march speed for archers with the chance of a second active skill. You've got a really, really solid just 1 march there as well, and keep in mind, Herman, Lao Che, and Nevsky, no matter which one you pick, those commanders are going to carry on into a further murderball, since all those marches are going to be super powerful, and they all have definitely got some future and potential investments you could go for. So now that you've probably picked your 1 march for your whole murderball, this is where you move on to 2 marches, and at this point, you just pick one of the marches you didn't pick before. Let's say you picked infantry, maybe you pick cavs or archers, and that's obviously very, very fine. In my opinion though, the best 2 march murderball you could make would be a Zhulang with a Herman, and also a Scipio with a Lao Che, because all 4 of those commanders deal AoE. Herman's AoE poison effect really does help ramp that up, and obviously all the AoE debuffs are going to be fully benefit from from all your AoE commanders, because Yu Lang is going to hit a target that's taking 30% more health, Herman's going to hit a target that's also got 30% less health, Lao Che is going to hit a target with 30% less health, and they're all going to hit targets with more skill damage, and all the targets are going to do less all damage. Whereas with Nevsky Joan, you don't have as much utility. Not to say it's a bad March at all, but Nevsky is a single target commander. A lot of these commanders are doing AoE debuffs, which if you do AoE damage, you can benefit from even more. Do keep in mind though, Joan is also dealing in AoE, so that March is still certainly viable. I'm not saying it's bad at all, and if you choose to have a Cav March, Nevsky Joan within your first 2 marches is really good. But the fact of the matter is, Zhu Lang with Herman and a Sepia with a Lao Che is going to be a slightly stronger March than if you dropped one of those marches and you put a Nevsky instead, but Nevsky is still going to do really well. If you were to move on to 3 marches, really simply, you just grab Nevsky. So now at this point, you've got a Zhu Lang with a Herman Prime, you've got a Scipio Africanus with a Lao Che as your main infantry march because of all its debuffs and crazy damage, you've got a Nevsky with a Joan because it's the best Cav March, and then you've got a really, really solid 3 March Murderball. And in that Murderball, that's probably where most free-to-play players will stick around. 3 marches, 1 of each troop type. You gradually upgrade it when a new astounding commander comes out. Like for example, if you're a free-to-play, you probably didn't get Hao Che Bing. Maybe you did if you're a Cav main, but most players didn't, and they stuck with Nevsky Joan. And then maybe when the new version of Nevsky releases or a new crazy strong cavalry primary, you replace Nevsky, something like that. That's your main goal as a free-to-play. So 3 marches is the best spot in my personal opinion. I only run 3 marches myself. And then you can gradually upgrade those marches as more and more commanders do release. Do keep in mind though, you can definitely go to 4 and 5 marches, and I will be discussing those now. So now that you've made the best 3 March Murderball possible, when you move into 4 marches, once again, there are 3 ways you can go here, and there's going to be 1 for each troop type. The first route which I'd recommend, and this is probably the best march to grab at the moment, would be to get a Boudica with a YSG. The reason I recommend this as your 4th march is because YSG has definitely been making a comeback with Herman's AoE debuff. It really just boosts him to the next level, and Boudica's single target debuff is going to do really good with your Nevsky and also any other single targets that you're hitting. She's going to help decimate them. So Boudica with YSG, lots of potential right there to go on your Murderball. YSG, a lot of players do have access to him, so that's something fairly good, and that means you can probably make this 4th march a little bit earlier than some of the other marches I'm going to mention, which require commanders a lot of players may not have access to. Also, keep in mind, Boudica is a very tanky archer commander for the most part. Even though she does get targeted somewhat, she still has a lot of open field potential with normal attack bonuses and tons of skill damage reduction. So she's going to take less AoE damage, and she's also going to basically be dealing a ton of extra normal damage. Put with YSG, who's got a rage engine and crazy skill damage, you've got AoE, you've got crazy single target, and it's boosted by Herman. You couldn't really go wrong for your 4th march. If you did decide to get an infantry march for your 4th march, you'd probably get a Guan with a Scipio, which in my opinion, into 4 marches is really, really good. And then you'd put your Lao Che with a Gorgo, which once again, in my opinion, is really, really good when you move into 4 marches. Splitting up the Scipio and the Lao Che is almost necessary here because Gorgo is such a powerful commander, but she only really works with Lao Che. So you want to split up that Scipio right there to get full value. Another option if you don't have Gorgo and if you have Sargon with Lao Che is also an extremely powerful march. So keep that in mind. Those 2 marches are going to be really good if you did want 4 marches and you decided to get infantry. If you wanted to get a cavalry march, which I would say is once again probably the weaker option out of the 3 marches, I would get a Hao Che Bing with a William. This isn't a weak march at all. I would just say, in my opinion, it's a little bit more of a support march. Hao Che Bing is a little bit of a difficult commander to run in the regard you can't jump through resource nodes and still get value out of him. You kind of want to be on the open field for a little bit of time, and in that way, it can be a little bit annoying to run. So a lot of players don't find him the most amazing commander. I think he's still very, very good, don't get me wrong, but if you did want to run him for 4 marches and you're a Cav main, it's certainly reasonable. Hao Che Bing, really strong commander, crazy single target damage, march speed reductions, tons of stuff going on in his kit with Williams, crazy debuffs and crazy buffs. You've got a very solid 4th Cav march right there. So just as a recap, in my opinion, the best 4 marches you can run on the open field are a Boudica with a YSG, a Zhu Lang with a Herman for your archer marches. Your infantry marches, you're still running the Scipio Africanus with the Lao Che, and for your Cav marches, you are still running that Nevsky with the Joan Prime. Very, very solid 4 March Murderball right there. Very achievable. Obviously, you've got YSG in there. Super easy to get. And Boudica, a lot of players have access to her. If you did decide to move into 5 marches, you pick up probably the infantry march in my opinion, and you just run a Guan with a Scipio, and you also run a Gorgo with a Lao Che. Gorgo and Lao Che, tons of synergy with Gorgo dealing just extra smite damage factor on her 3rd skill right here. And also, Gogo just tons of synergy with Lao Che. She's got tons of normal damage bonuses. Her active skill costs less rage. She also deals up to 10% more normal damage if she's run as the primary. She gets more counter attack. She takes less skill damage on active skill. Really, really, really powerful commander right here. The only downside, she deals less skill damage after she launches her active skill, but with Lao Che, it's completely ignored. So Gorgo with Lao Che is super powerful March. Guan Yu, tried and true commander. When you're moving into 5 March at this point, his AoE silence is really good, especially if you end up in a small murderball fight. He's got some decent damage as well. The only thing he lacks is mainly the fact that he doesn't have too much tankiness, and that's where CPO can come in and make that March much stronger. If you don't like one though, you could get Sargon, but that's more of a substitute, which I won't talk about too much. So for 5 Marches, as a recap, Guan with CPO, Gorgo with Lao Che. Then you want to go for your Archer Marches, sticking with the Boudica YSG and also the Zulang and the Herman. And then for your Cav Marches, you are going to stick with that Nevsky and Joan combo, which is still going to be extremely powerful. Now, moving into 6 Marches for your Murderball, this is where I say Hao Che being with William becomes much more powerful and much more basically useful, because when we look at William's kit, his 4th skill, he's basically able to allow you to get up to 5 of your allied or friendly troops, including his own troop, around 50 extra rage per second and 20% extra defense for 3 seconds. It's a really, really powerful buff. Put that with your Jones active skill buff, your rage gain is going to be extremely, extremely good, but I feel that having 6 Marches is where this becomes really powerful. Once again though, you can still consider running him with 5 Marches, but often with 5 Marches, one could lag behind or one could get swarmed out, and then your Williams buff is only down to 4 of your own troops. And yes, you are buffing your allies, but I think when you're focusing on your Murderball, you almost want to focus a little bit on yourself, because the stronger your Murderball is, the more enemies you can take out and the easier it is for your kingdom. So keep that in mind. I think William's best with 6 Marches. It means it's a little bit hard to access as a free-to-play low spender, but for 5 or even 4 Marches, he's certainly still reasonable. Just keep in mind, you really do want to have around 5 at least to access his full value on that buff. He does have some really good debuffs though. He's got some decent cav AoE, and Hao Che Bing's faster rage cycle just works really well with him as well. So I'm a big fan of the William Hao Che Bing March, but I think it's better towards your 5th and 6th March slot. Personally, I think it is good in the 6th slot because Guan Yu with CPO is really, really powerful, and bringing Gorgo in for that 5th March really boosts Lao Che to that next level. But if you're a free-to-play who can't access Gorgo, then Hao Che Bing with William is a very solid option, and then you just stick with the CPO and the Lao Che as well. That means for your 6 March Murderball, which is where most whales would really sit at, you're going to be running a Nevsky with a Joan. You're going to be running that Hao Che Bing with the William for your Cav Marches. For your infantry, you will run a Gorgo with a Lao Che, one of the best, if not the only Smite March in the game. You run a CPO with a Guan with a CPO, and then finally you will run your Archer Marches, which is a Zulang with a Herman and a Boudica with a YSG. So now moving into your 7th March, there are 4 ways you could go here, and I think that every single way is equally as powerful. This time, I don't think there's one way that's the best. You just pick whichever troop type you're maining. If you're maining archers, infantry, cavalry, or you want a leadership march, you pick one of those marches. If you decide for your 7th March you want to pick archers, in my opinion, you're going to end up changing up your Murderball ever slightly. You're going to run a Boudica with an Artemisia, you're sticking with that Zulang and the Herman, and then you're going to run a Henry with a YSG. That's going to be your best 3 March Murderball. If Ashurbanipal is really strong, which I think he does have the potential, you can consider changing up the Murderball again and running an Ashurbanipal primary with a Herman secondary, and also running a Boudica with a Zulang, or a Boudica with an Artemisia, and then a Henry with a Zulang, depending on if you want YSG or not. So that would be your probably best 3 March Archer Ball, because Ashurbanipal definitely looks good, but he's not fully in the game. We can't make a full judgment on that right now. So for 7 Marches, I'd say that you either run Ashurbanipal or you run the Zulang with your Henrys. That definitely depends on how good Ashurbanipal is in the open field. Personally, I think he's going to be pretty good, but we'll see when he fully releases. If you did decide to run 3 infantry marches, I think you're just going to stick with the Guan CPO and the Gorgo and the Lao Che, and then you're just going to pick a Tarek and a Sargon. Those 2 commanders are the two leftover strongest infantry commanders in the game. You can consider Pakal Harold if you're a big whale, but in my opinion, I think he's starting to become outdated. He does lose in pretty much every battle against archers, and he loses to a CPO and a Lao Che pretty much all the time. So Harold with Pakal is only really good if you're doing city popping a lot, or maybe if you're rallying with Tarek. But mainly you're going to run Tarek with a Sargon, and I think the Sargon debuffs are really good, and Tarek is just an okay primary or even a secondary commander depending on who you choose to run as the primary. If you wanted to run a third cavalry march, there's two ways you could go here. You could run a Zhang Yu with a Chandragupta or a Zhang Yu actually with a Justinian. Either one of those marches is really good. In my opinion, I'd run the Chandragupta at this point for his really powerful debuffs. Your final option though is to run an Attila and a Takeda, and as a whale, I think Attila Takeda is actually fairly strong and has a lot of uses, so you could run Attila Takeda as well for your third cav march. If you did decide to get a leadership march, well, I'd recommend a Trajan and a Honda. I think that's probably your best bet at this point. Trajan, crazy amounts of buffs, and Honda, obviously a very strong just secondary at all times. Do keep in mind though, it is proven that running 7 DPS marches compared to Trajan buffs right now is actually better. So for now, I'd say you'd rather run either an extra cav, infantry, or archer march than running a Trajan, but he is still an option if you want to buff your own marches or your allies' marches, or if you're doing flag swarms, he does also benefit a lot by buffing your own marches there. So that means for your 7 March Murderball, depending on what you choose, you're probably going to be running something like this. Azul Lang with a Herman, a Boudica with a YSG. This could change if you choose 3 archer marches. You're going to run a Nevsky with a Joan Prime, because that's obviously still going to be very good, and also William with Hao Che Bing being the primary in this march. You're going to run the Gorgo with the Lao Che for your infantry, and the Guan Yu with the Scipio as well, and then finally you're going to pick whichever 7th march I recommended before, depending on which troop type you like the most. So now that we've made it to the end of today's video, and I've made, in my opinion, the best 7 marches possible, I want to ask you guys for a very small favor, and that is, tell me, what do you think of the 7 marches I recommended? Do you think Boudica YSG might be too experimental as a 4th march? Do you think maybe I was completely wrong about one of the march pairings? Or do you think the Murderball was pretty accurate? Tell me down below in the comments. I do always find your comments very interesting. They help me get a vibe of if I'm doing something right or wrong, because I'm always happy to change my opinion if I'm obviously very wrong. So let me know in the comments down below. I always read all your comments. You always get a heart and a response from me. So now I just want to say I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.